So I'd like to welcome everyone to this year's Philosophy, Disability and Social Change Conference, number 3. My name is Jonathan Wolfe, Joe Wolfe. I'm a professor at the Blavatnik School. I'm a white man, swept back, graying hair, which also tells you something about my age. I'm wearing roundish glasses and several layers of sweatshirt and cardigan because of the weather in London where I am today. Although the Blavatnik School, of course, is part of the University of Oxford. I would like to thank the Blavatnik School and the Alfred Landecker program that is funding this event, and also to give my very grateful thanks to Jamie Morris, who is assisting us with AV, putting the show together, and also the professional teams at the Blavatnik School, the events team and communication team that have done a lot of work behind the scenes to get this running. But most of all, I'd like to thank my co-host, Shelley, who has put the program together and once again has amazed me with what she's been able to accomplish and the incredible lineup of speakers and topics. So let me pass over to Shelley, who will introduce the day and then also our first speaker.
Thanks, Jonathan. I will first describe myself and my surroundings. I'm a white woman with short, messy, graying hair and large plastic glasses. I'm wearing a dark, long-sleeved shirt. Behind me on my right is a window with curtains and a clock on the wall. I want to open the conference with a land acknowledgement. The land from which I am joining this conference is the ancestral territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations around the Great Lakes. On behalf of the organizers, presenters, and chairs of Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change 3, I want to offer the teachings of the next 4 days with respect for and in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and other colonized settler states who for thousands of years have held sacred the land, water, and air, as well as their inhabitants, and who for centuries have protected them from the ravages of colonialism and expropriation. On December 6th, a day when we remember the 14 women murdered at L'École Polytechnique in Montreal in 1989, we must also think about the murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits, and the continuing legacy of racism, misogyny, and colonialism that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits confront on a daily basis. Before I introduce our first presenter, I want to make a few remarks about the discussions that will occur throughout the next 4 days. That is, I want to remind everyone that we are trying to create a safe and vibrant space in philosophy for disabled philosophers and philosophers of disability, especially disabled philosophers of disability. Philosophy of disability should be transformative of philosophy and of philosophers themselves, including ourselves. We need to transform the ways in which we talk to each other about disability and understand each other, in addition to changing the ways that the discipline and profession talk about us and represent us. In other words, the conference aims to be a safe and vibrant space to cultivate new ways to do philosophy and new ways to do it together, with each other and for each other. In addition to our more evident aim of cultivating a space to advance new ways in which to do philosophy of disability. I hope everyone sharing, presenting, and attending this conference has a wonderful time over the next few days. The presentations will be fantastic, I guarantee. Please feel free to live tweet throughout the conference, and indeed I encourage you to do so by using our hashtag uppercase P, lowercase hi, uppercase D, lowercase is, uppercase S, lowercase oc, uppercase C, lowercase h, 3. It is now my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our first presenter, who is none other than the fabulous Andrea J. Pitts, whose presentation is entitled North American Gore Capitalism, Able Nationalism, and Necropolitics Across 3 Settler States. Andrea is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and works in an array of programs and research centers there, including the Department of Africana Studies, the Latin American Studies Program, and the Women's and Gender Studies Program. With Marina Ortega and Jose Medina, Andrea co-edited Theories of the Flesh, Latinx and Latin American Feminism, Transformation and Resistance, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. With Mark Westmoreland, Andrea published, co-edited On Bergson, Examining Race and Colonialism through the writings of Henri Bergson, published by SUNY Press in 2019 and in 2021, they published a monograph with SUNY Press entitled Nos Otras, Gloria y Anzaldúa, Multiplicitous Agency and Resistance, which offers a sustained discussion of Anzaldúa's relevance for disability justice scholarship and activism. In recent work, Andrea has continued to develop and expand this research focus on disability justice, including in a chapter for the forthcoming collection, The Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability, which I've edited. Their tremendously insightful chapter of the book serves as the basis for their presentation with us today. So here's how things will go. Andrea will talk for about 30 minutes and then take your questions and comments. I will moderate the Q&A. Before I turn things over to Andrea, I'd like to remind you of the captioning function at the bottom of your screen. I also want to remind you to put your questions and comments for Andrea in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen rather than in the chat section. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Jonathan. And thank you all for being here today. I'm Andrea Pitts. I'm a mixed Latinx person with dark hair and a short fade haircut. I'm wearing a sweater over a collared shirt in front of a set of double doors in my office with 2 art pieces hanging on the wall above a short bookcase behind me. There may also be a cat somewhere in here. So thank you all. I'm also speaking to you from the land of the Catawba Nation, who continue to fight for food sovereignty, land reclamation, and language resurgence here in this region of the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. I'm also going to share some materials here. I think I can only share with the hosts and the panelists, so I'm going to ask that somebody please forward this along to the participants. Just while I'm getting these queued up, those are my slides. And I will also share my transcript. I ask folks not to distribute these, as these are works in progress, which I'll say a bit about in just a minute. So let me go ahead and share my screen. For the presentation, I will have some slides here, and I ask again for folks to please share those links in the chat for anybody who would like to follow along. I'll describe some of the images, but I will also I also have alt text embedded in the images, and so hopefully that will also help folks if you access this through a screen reader or other device. Okay, so just briefly, this is going to say in a moment about some of the motivations for this, but this is a kind of exploratory piece for me that I wanted to take up Shelley's invitation to discuss here with you all today and for this wonderful conference. I had a fantastic time last year. I am tremendously grateful to Shelley and Jonathan for putting this together, and to Shelley for also inviting me to be part of the Bloomsbury edited collection that she's been working on. It's really exciting work, and I'm honored to be a part of it. And so this is, again, Shelley prompts me to kind of revisit some of this work through her generous invitations. And so this is really, I think, has been a really just incredible space for me to think and to develop my research. So thank you again. So what I'm going to do on the slide here, I have just a brief presentation outline. It's just going to be 2 parts, some introductions and motivations to what I'm thinking about for this project, and then what I call a triptych of able nationalism and necropolitics. And it's going to look at Mexico and Canada largely, although I will mention the United States, although my emphasis today won't necessarily be the United States, as I'll mention in a moment, because I've done a lot of work elsewhere on the United States. So I think I want to mention just some motivations that will explain a bit about what I've been working on. And so I first kind of started examining and thinking transnationally about what I'll say in a moment about able nationalism and necropolitics through the study of what I describe as carceral medicine, which I began looking at and using as a term to describe the provision and the kind of institutionalization of medicine across prisons, jails, and detention facilities. And so I take it to refer not only, I use the term carceral medicine in my other research, some of which is hyperlinked here throughout. So anybody who's accessing this, there are images of different articles and chapters and things that I've worked on the topic of carceral medicine and structural racism within carceral settings. And I use that language not only to describe the provision and institutionalization of healthcare within prisons and other carceral facilities, but also the carceral logics that extend outside of the brick and mortar institutions of carceral facilities to look at how systems of confinement and punishment operate within medical institutions as well. And so out, in hospitals and other I mean, you could think about eugenics and asylum settings, but also residential schools and boarding schools for Indigenous peoples that themselves were inflicted with both medicalized and carceral and colonial apparatus. So I've used that term elsewhere, and I won't dive into too much, but there's a lot of references here if people want to look at some of this previous work. And I also more recently, I've been trying to unpack some transnational dimensions of carceral medicine, including forms of humanitarian assistance that effectively export and train Mexican judges and prosecutors and provide U.S. correctional healthcare certification to Mexican prisons. And so I did some of that work in a few recent pieces, also hyperlinked here with images of the publications there, and a piece on able nationalism in the war on drugs, and also a piece on interventionism and what's called neo-interventionism. And one of the programs that I looked at, which is on the bottom right here, is a program called the Culture of Lawfulness, which was or is a program designed for middle schools in Mexico, which was part of what's called the Merida Initiative, which was a transnational agreement between Mexico and the US that is now supposedly no longer in place, but that in fact put in programming for youth in middle schools to learn how to become lawful citizens. And so that itself was part of an attempt to shore up what I'm describing as the kind of carceral extension and exportation of the carceral apparatus from the United States into Mexico. Although through this work on carceral medicine, it became increasingly clear to me that the theoretical discourses of disability and forms of disability activism were immensely helpful to unpack the forms of harm and constraint that are embedded within carceral systems. And so, as I've mentioned, in other work, and so I have a link, just the chapters, the abstract for Shelley's book, the chapter that I'm working on for Shelley's book here. Shelley's work historicizing disability discourses has been immensely helpful in this regard for framing disability and debility as and other folks like Jasbir Puar's work has also been helpful in this sense. But so too people like Liat Ben Moshe's work on prison abolitionism and carceral ableism, and then another framework by Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell, who coined the term able nationalism, which I'll return to in just a moment. And so these have been helpful terms for me to begin to work on these topics of carceral medicine. And so this dive into disability studies and activism has allowed me to begin to unpack some of the relationship between, for example, the war on drugs and disability discourses. And the piece for Shelley's book is exploring what I describe as the apparatus of addiction, also drawing from Shelley's work on the language of apparatus of disability, which I use to kind of frame the use of colonial dimensions of ableism and their relationship to the control and regulation of controlled substances. And then there's a lot more to say there, but I'll kind of leave that as a teaser for folks to check out the forthcoming book, which is not only includes this chapter, but also many other wonderful chapters. So I've been, the transnational influence for me, I think is important because I've been asked as various times, not only does my work itself focus on Latin America and the kind of relationship between US and Latin American politics, including specifically US-Mexico relations, but I've also worked and researched with some scholars in Ontario, Canada, and I've been asked to compare at certain points the Canadian carceral medical situation and institutionalizations with that of the US, for example. And so I taught a seminar at University of Waterloo last year and worked with some students there to kind of link the history of eugenics in Canada to the colonial carceral state in Canada. And I've also been thinking through the kind of the ways in which Canadian Medicare, funded and run through the 13 provinces and territories of Canada, has led to health outcomes for incarcerated peoples. And so there's a much longer story to tell here, but the systemic forms of neglect and undertreatment, we find those for preventable illnesses across Canadian prisons, which, to be clear, Canadian prisons themselves are the only federally run medical provisions within Canada. Of course, the others are through provinces and territories, but I think there's really important analyses and investigations going on and how healthcare is provided at the federal level across prisons in Canada. But again, more of that for later, and I want to focus today on a slightly different angle here. So I'm going to just now walk through 3 terms that I'm going to be using in the talk that I think will be helpful to kind of have available. And so what I'm going to use today is I'm going to use the language of a triptych as kind of set of 3, which also corresponds to the 3 settler nation states of North America, to note some differential and shared relations across all 3. And this is exploratory, it's not meant to be conclusive, so I welcome your thoughts on how to constructively extend this analysis. I've noted that I think there's some really excellent work on systems of confinement and disability politics across the US and Canada. And there's also really interesting work on the shared colonial relations and racial geographies between Mexico and the US, and really interesting work on Mexican and Canadian neoliberal environmental policy and settler colonialism, although I found little that actually brings all 3 into purview and dialogue. And so I want to try to do that a bit today. There's also some grant funding that would be amazing to receive in order to kind of do that transnational work across 3 contexts. But let me start here with some terms to define. So the first term is from Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell's 2015 book, and a term that they use here is titled able nationalism. And this is a useful term for me in this talk because it refers to Jasbir Puar's notion of homo-nationalism as a relational praxis that considers forms of LGBTQ political inclusion for example, same-sex marriage or LGBT-friendly tourism, as these forms of inclusion as sharing in the homogenization of population and the interventionist foreign policies of nation states. So like homonationalism, in which specific persons considered under the LGBT umbrella are modeled and valorized for the domestic policies of a given nation state, able nationalism creates forms of exceptionalism and valuation, and that presents some segments of this population as worthy of national protections and inclusions, while others are ignored or considered disposable by the state. And the aims of these neoliberal policies and patterns of exceptionalism thereby create notions of deserving and undeserving disabled people, which reifies patterns of normalization and existing matrices of structural violence, including white supremacy, heterosexism, and global capitalism. So similar to critiques of nationalism, able nationalism focuses on rights-based forms of inclusion within domestic and foreign state policy that create notions of a racialized, sexualized, disabled, and gendered bourgeois citizen who is considered a justified and rightful recipient of state protections. Another term here, necropolitics, deriving from Achille Mbembe's work. This is a term now I'm quoting here, whereas Foucault initially defined biopolitics as a power to take control of both the body and life, or life in general, Mbembe poses the question of under what practical conditions is the right to kill, to allow to live, or to expose to death exercised. Mbembe suggests that for some, weapons are deployed to create death worlds, conferring upon them the status of the living dead. Mbembe's original conception was meant as an intervention into biopolitics to account for bodily suffering and death among people living under conditions of exceptional violence. However, recent extensions have examined how disabled individuals, racial minorities, and people working as essential workers, for example, become disposable bodies who have been put in positions of chronic exposure to unsafe conditions. And the designation of disabled bodies as dispensable we can find in a number of places, including, for example, in a recent piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, which recommends putting disabled and elderly patients as the lowest priority when distributing scarce medical resources. So it's just an extension and an analysis of necropolitics. And these are moving quickly, so for the sake of time. The last is a concept that I find quite helpful in terms of framing and beginning from the context of Mexico to then frame the North American landscape, is a term called Gore Capitalism from Sayak Valencia's work. And this is from the 2018 translation of her book titled Gore Capitalism. So this is a conceptualization which denotes the explicit and unjustified shedding of blood, the high price to pay by the global South to declare, the high percentage of guts and dismemberment frequently intertwined with organized crime, the binary division of gender and sexuality, the predatory use of bodies, hyperconsumerism, all of this employing the most explicit forms, the explicit violence as a form of necro empowerment, which I can say more about later. While Gore Capitalism is a form of dystopian economics visible in the criminal enterprises of formerly colonial and neo-colonial countries such as Mexico, it has tangible dimensions in the United States, according to Sayak, Valencia, and Falcon in 2018, that it has also modalities in the context of the United States. Two that they raise are the internal borderization through institutional racism and the production of death within racialized communities, which demonstrate the quotidian murdering of Black people by the police without there being any real justice for the victims. And they also mentioned the reinforcement of hateful narratives against immigrants in general and populations from the global South. Hate speech has resulted in immigrants' incarceration in detention centers managed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And we saw no end to that, not only under Trump, but we've seen previously deportation regimes through Obama and other Democratic presidents as well. So those are just three brief terms that I'm going to use now throughout the rest of the talk. And I want to kind of shift now to kind of highlight this triptych to say a little bit about each of the contexts. And again, it's far too much for a 30-minute presentation, so I apologize for the brevity and the kind of sketch-like nature of what I'll say in a moment. So this next slide, section 2, a triptych of able nationalism and necropolitics, begins with Mexican Gore Capitalism, and it's focused. I want to take up Sayak Valencia and a brief set of stanzas that she uses to frame Tijuana in Mexico, Tijuana, the city of Tijuana, which she calls the capital of Gore. And she opens her book with a poem, Esto es Tijuana, this is Tijuana. And I want to give a content warning here that this contains some graphic language. But she mentions briefly narcos, machismos, Silicon Land, whore Barbie's factory, high caliber weapons, laughing, cackling, Esto es Tijuana. A frontera woman looks like death and walks with one hand on her revolver. The syringe man unsuccessfully attempts to fly along the middle of the metal serpent, the transparent and the true, the piercing. The limit, the perimeter, the edge of the world, he, she, they, what is dragged behind, the shore that licks white, middle-class, civilized culture and brings it to its end, the time bomb that detonates us, San Diego's garage. Everything that enters or leaves the city comes from two parts. Everything here leaves in two or more parts. You can have whatever you can buy, city of businesses, virgin girls for sale, affordable prices for foreigners, Luis Donaldo Colosio acribillado, AKA bullet riddled, música de banda, morgue, techno, nafta, esto es Tijuana. That's selections of the poem that she uses to frame her book, Gore Capitalism. And there's an image here of the neon lights of Tijuana from a 1950s postcard taken at street level. So Valencia's book and her words here depict the brutality and senses of necropolitical creativity found in this place that Gloria Ansaldúa described as una herida abierta, an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. Narcos, musicians, assassinated politicians like Luis Donaldo Colosio, sex work, illicit drug trades, maimings, and spectacles of violence. These features bring Tijuana and Mexico's legal and illegal economies of gore to light. Valencia's work foregrounds the term gore, taken from a film genre, to frame the functions of advanced capitalism in North America. So within Mexico, Ariadna Esteves writes of Valencia that she takes the term gore from a cinematic genre focusing on extreme and blunt violence so that she can describe the third world's current stage of capitalism in which blood, corpses, mutilated bodies, and captive lives are tooled in capital reproduction. In Gore Capitalism, murder becomes a transaction, violence a tool, and torture empowerment. She establishes violence as an interpretive category, cutting across different dimensions of knowledge and action with symbolic and actual consequences. Violence becomes a tool of self-affirmation as well as a means of survival, a way of life, work, socialization, and culture. In her view, violence is a new epistemology, a set of relations tying our time with discursive and other types of practices originated in the current stage of capitalism, neoliberalism. Within this frame, each modality of Gore capitalism, maiming, torture, sexual violence, occur both through governmental and non-governmental entities. And while it's perhaps easier to consider brutality in terms of non-governmental violence through the horrors committed by drug cartels in Mexico, for example, each offering their own signature or brand of particularly public forms of dismemberment and paramilitary devastation, Valencia also brings into focus the governmental complicity and political dependency and benefit offered through the distribution and commodification of violence. In Mexico, that's often considered through the lenses of the state's own repressive and corrupt participation in the enactment of violence. The next slide here continues this analysis of Mexican Gore capitalism. So for example, the brutal police and paramilitary attack on a caravan of 5 buses transporting college students in 2014 led to the killing of 6, the wounding of 40, and the disappearance of 43 rural and peasant student activists. This event, perhaps tied to drug trafficking, for which the families and loved ones of the victims of that night continue to demand justice, remains one of the most egregious examples of police-involved violence and corruption in recent years. To connect this brutal event with able nationalism and disability politics, we need to understand a bit about the state's motivations for the repression of these students. Notably, Obed Frausto and Nayar Lopez Castellanos write regarding the Ayotzinapa attack, which is where it's referred to, the Ayotzinapa attack, that it constitutes an expression of a necropolitics in which citizens' lives have become disposable. The brutality is explained by the marginality of these peasant sectors and the offensive against indigenous communities and their autonomous forms of organization. So the Ayotzinapa Rural Normal School, in which these young people were studying, offers a bicultural academic project that trains students to understand different cultural expressions, develop a broad knowledge of Indigenous people's lives, and acquire hermeneutical tools for the constitution of a comprehensive and inclusive intercultural dialogue. Moreover, the school itself, where these students were studying prior to the attack, has dynamic ideological and political training that's considered subversive by the Mexican state. And the school itself has murals of the faces of Che Guevara, Lenin, Zapata, and Subcomandante Marcos, many of those for whom there's a very significant leftist political orientation itself. And so the school trains students to play an active role, seeking not only to produce educators, but also influence the community's political consciousness. And so in this sense, the school had been a target for defunding and repression long before the particularly brutal attack in 2014. So shifting to the experiences of survivors from that attack, we can note that there was actually quite medical complicity with the death of these politicized students. So one surgeon interviewed about the night of this massacre and the disappearances stated that he refused to treat the wounded students who were brought to his private hospital in Iguala, Guerrero that evening. So an interviewer asked, "Did you attend to the wounded?" And the surgeon answers no. And when asked why not, the surgeon replies, "It wasn't my obligation. If someone arrives nicely, then I attend to him or her. This particular patient was mixed up," in his words, "was mixed up in adult things. And that's what happens to all those Ayotzinapos, because the school is worthless. They invade property, that is a crime. They leave things dirty, ugly, and the government has to pay for it. And that bothers me because it drains the government. They are criminals." The interviewer then asks, "That is a crime? That seems wrong to you? So cutting off their faces, cutting out their eyes, cutting off their limbs, and incinerating their bodies, that seems right to you?" The surgeon replies, quote, "Yes, truthfully, yes." Supporting this kind of state-invested neglect and contempt by medical providers, one student survivor of that night also recollects, a sophomore now from the school who survived the attack, says, quote, "When I arrived, the hospital doctor asked me my name. I told him my name. Then he asked me where I was coming from. I told him I was coming from the Ayotzinapa College. He says, 'They should have killed you,' he snarled, 'fucking Ayotzinapo.' He didn't give me any medical attention. A military nurse attended to me and told the doctors I'll take care of the boy," end quote. These remarks came after this survivor of the attack notes that he was waiting with several others who were wounded in the police raid, including people who sustained bullet wounds in the hands and the mouth. These testimonies from survivors and medical providers, as well as the broader political context for the repression of Ayotzinapa students and educators, demonstrates the level through which the defenses of the lawfulness within Mexico become ensconced in necropolitical demands to quell indigenous and peasant mobilizations. The images here, which I have four images from a Tumblr site started by Valeria Gallo, dedicated to the 43 who were disappeared that night, called to illustrators to draw and remember the students who were disappeared and demand justice on their behalf. So some of the names listed of the missing, like Alexander Mora Venancio and Martin Getsemani Sanchez Garcia, are asking where they are and demanding their return. One abstract portrait reads, "If you forget me, they win." And the other image here, and I have alt text listed for all of these, is an image of a young boy's face with the map of Latin America behind it and 2 bullet holes for eyes. And then the background are images of the 43 disappeared. Importantly, Ariadna Esteves distinguishes between necropower in the first world and necropower in the third world. She describes necropower in the third world as a necropolitical governmentalization of the state, which refers to, and I have this listed here on the next slide, which is for shifting to US Gore Capitalism and Canadian Gore Capitalism, as a type of the state that has merged with criminal organizations and uses the apparatuses and knowledge to deal with death in the situation it creates. So the state becomes an administrator and facilitator of illegal businesses and the deathly consequences of violence. In the first world, however, Estevez includes both Canada and the US, and she describes necropower as the rule of law necropower, because first world countries, particularly the US and Canada, claim to guide their actions with the legal principles of the rule of law, such as accountability, just laws, open government, accessible justice, although not necessarily the moral ones, such as fairness, justice, and truth. First world necropowers policies and decisions could fail to be fair, just, or even humane, but they are always legal, because necropower works not above or below the law, but through it. She also mentions that we see then things like mass incarceration, hate crimes, the deportation of refugees, and the social abandonment of the poor and marginalized as being framed through law. So referring to the state's own enactment and protection of violence through police brutality, we can consider in the US context Valencia and Falcon's interpretation of the border control industries in the US and policing and carceral apparatus, of which I mentioned I've worked on quite a bit. And each of these claim rationales for the violence they enact, whether it's dumping out water left in the Sonoran Desert, left by humanitarian aid workers in the name of deterrence policies, or the firing of bullets into a home during the no-knock raid, which killed Breonna Taylor in 2020. The cover of the rule of law upholds this violence and the trauma, maiming, and death that it entails. And for the sake of time, I won't dwell too much on this national context, and I'll defer to some of my other work and that of Mitchell and Snyder to frame able nationalist tropes in this context. So the last example I want to give here is a shift now to Canadian Gore capitalism, which I think kind of bookends some of the framing that like I said, I've done more work on the US context. So this is an attempt to try to bring in a broader scope across the three nation states. I want to briefly mention the Canadian context to frame North America here. Notably, Estevez includes Canada as a participant within rule of law necropolitics, and she has researched and written extensively about the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline project as a necropolitical form of extractivism that functions as a form of the dispossession of the health, ways of life, means of obtaining resources, sociocultural practices and identities for Indigenous peoples. For the purpose of this presentation, I want to turn to another example in my last few minutes here from the Canadian context to underscore the relationship between necropolitics and able nationalism. And I want to consider here how we might find both the rule of law necropolitics as well as this kind of illicit underside of Gore capitalism, where we see now illegal patterns of violence that likewise lead to the debilitation, disablement, and slow deaths of populations. So I want to consider some events here of the so-called Freedom Convoy that occurred in January and February of this year. I have three images here, which I'll describe in just a moment, that are depicted from that event. As some of you may remember, in January of 2022, a small group of truckers starting in British Columbia, then gathering some numbers in Saskatchewan, estimated to be within the hundreds, and then eventually arriving to the federal capital in Ottawa in late January, were loosely united through demands to end vaccine and masking mandates that impacted truckers and other workers. And another issue that potentially largely united this group was a shared disdain for the leader of the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau. Notably, the convoy was also organized and accompanied by a host of far right-wing and right-wing interest groups, from Canada Unity, a group that publicly called for the overthrow of elected leaders in Canada, and who issued an MOU calling for Trudeau to be removed due to unfounded claims that he had committed treason and crimes against humanity. And other groups who attended the protests included QAnon conspiracy theorists and other anti-government conspiracy groups. To bring our connections directly to necropolitics, we can turn to the seizure of weapons at the Coutts border crossing between Alberta and Montana. Occurring at the same time as the Ottawa protests, 13 people were arrested and a large cache of weapons and ammunition were seized by the RCMP. So the far right picture is an image of the arms and ammunitions that were seized. They're displayed on a table, including military gear. While truckers blocked and honked in Ottawa, receiving mild and sometimes supportive reception from Ottawa police, which contrasted sharply how police have responded to First Nations protesters on Parliament Hill and elsewhere. A smaller group of protesters had blocked the Coots border crossing. And according to recently unsealed records, the group transporting these weapons and ammunition believed that the real goal for the protest included altering Canada's political, judicial, and medical systems. Within the cache of weapons were also materials associated with the white ethno-nationalist group Diagolon, and the Ottawa protests themselves also included displays of Confederate flags, swastikas, and racist and anti-Semitic images and dog whistles. So while the Coots seizure grates against the rule of law, right, RCMPs infiltrated and investigated that conspiracy theory, I propose that we can read the differential treatment and permissibility of the Freedom Convoy and the defense of the protesters from conservative members of parliament like Candice Bergen, Pierre Poilievre, and Andrew Scheer as a blurring of the rule of law and governmentalization of necropolitics. Moreover, the Give, Send, Go crowdfunding campaigns that were at a center of controversy during the demonstration raised over $9.6 million from US and Canadian donors, also received several dozen donations from current and former Ontario police officers. And such forms of monetary, public political support and police permissibility in the nation's capital and elsewhere as forms of support show that there's a subtle shift from rule of law to the governmentalization of necropolitics. This lastly, it's the image is here. There's an image of a protester holding a sign that says "Hold the line" in front of several of the trucks that say "Mandate freedom, freedom for children," and then a line of trucks that have freedom on their bumpers. The last image here, though, I think also connects us directly to able nationalism. So there were, this is my last slide, there were activists, for example, like Eileen Davidson, who's photographed on the right, who was a counter-protester in February in BC, who holds a little sign that says ableism is discrimination. It causes people to prioritize the health, safety, and independence of non-disabled people at the expense of those with disabilities. She's pointing here to the disregard for disabled people in the convoy's demands to remove masks and vaccine passports. And so on her blog, she writes that public health mandates protect the disabled, elderly, and immunocompromised. So that's not going to be news to anyone at this conference. But I think a really interesting read comes from a kind of another perspective that comes here regarding disability and the convoy comes from Daniel Piers and Kelly Frisch, who wrote a piece for Briar Patch magazine regarding the use of the image and memory of Terry Fox within the Freedom Convoy protests. So they note, quote, Terry Fox, who many Canadians will know, was a single-leg amputee who died of cancer in 1981 at the age of 22, and he became one of Canada's most iconic figures after he launched the Cross Canada Marathon to fundraise for cancer research. During the Freedom Convoy protests on Parliament Hill, protesters placed a placard, which I have in the center of the slide here, that said "Mandate Freedom" and the arms of a bronze statue of Fox in Ottawa. They also tied a Canadian flag around the neck of Fox's statue like a cape, placed a hockey hat on his head, and rested a pole holding an upside-down Canadian flag against his chest. So Piers and Frisch note that this wasn't the first instance of Fox's iconography being used by Freedom convoyers. In the year prior, there was another protester, Chris Sky Sakocha, who was arrested for disregarding Ontario's provincial emergency orders, who stood in front of the Terry Fox National Monument and spoke against public health measures to a crowd of supporters. So pointing to Fox's statue, Sakocha said, quote, "Like Fox, our Freedom Convoy is made up of Canadians who have been traveling across the country to raise awareness for an even greater issue." So the researchers' questions in this context was why the icons of Fox, Terry Fox, resonate with a particular form of Canadian right-wing eugenic white nationalism, and what this tells us about Canadian disability politics. And they link the iconography of Fox, so not Fox himself, the person, but the iconography of Fox, and charitable marathons like Fox's Marathon of Hope to what disability scholar Alison Kafer calls the curative imaginary, the ubiquitous ableist desire that we should eliminate disability through technological and scientific innovation, indicating that a future without disability is a future we should all want. And they're writing to critique this. They also note that Fox himself in 1980 when he started the Marathon of Hope, that this was a time of vocal Quebec sovereignty movements, rife anti-Quebec and anti-immigrant sentiment, and increasingly anti-Indigenous sovereignty protests and court battles. And as such, Fox came to symbolize a certain kind of Canadian unity that white Ontarians and Western Canadians could get behind, many of the people who were part of the Freedom Convoy. So Fox's promised Fox's promised route, starting mere miles, this is what they write, starting mere miles from where the British first settled in Newfoundland and headed against the wind towards Vancouver's shores, invoked ideas of Canadian discovery, romanticizing early exploration and survival against all odds. Most images of the Marathon of Hope were not of Fox running through the major cities purposefully threaded through the route to maximize fundraising capacity, but rather of Fox running through punishing weather against the backdrop of vast, wild, and seemingly uninhabited natural expanses. These images resonate with two of Canada's violent foundational myths, they write, that this land was an empty terra nullius where colonizers descended, and that settlers earned their place here due to their superior white grit and determination, end quote. And they continue, and this is the last couple points, they continue, where increasingly impoverished and houseless disabled people are only supported through spare chains, charities for cures, or medical assistance in dying, which Shelley Tremaine has written about extensively. It's little wonder that the Freedom Convoy claims Fox as an icon of the kind of Canadian unity they seek to build. Fox as an icon of hope, grit, and independence leads Canadians to feel, as disability study scholar Sally Shivers comments, more tied to an ideal Canadianness, even though, in fact, disabled Canadians face innumerable barriers to social inclusion. And so part of this then becomes Canadians united in their rejection of disability, continuing a long history that overwhelmingly eliminates, disappears, and disposes of disabled people through cure, institutionalization, or MAID. They also connect directly to the history of eugenics in Canada. So their analysis here ties the nationalist image of Fox to the foundations and legal apparatus of colonial ableism and its eugenicist roots. Accordingly, these spectacular uses of Canadian nationalism within the Freedom Convoy, the implications of Canadian economic distribution through fundraising and pipeline extractivism, and the illicit networks of weapons and conspiracies to overthrow governmental health care and democratically elected leaders, likewise begins to blur the edges between rule of law and governmentalization of necropolitics. So my last point here is that we see in all three contexts, when the lens of necropower and Gore capitalism in the Mexican state is the frame, is that there are consistent threads of violence throughout the North American landscape. Each part of the triptych retains differences, legal, cultural, and geopolitical, yet each converges on the disposability and degradation of disabled people's lives and our futures. And these colonial and carceral ableisms thereby create further demand to scrutinize the presumed innocence or of any settler nation's role in ableist violence, and to critique, for example, the romanticizing dreams of a third world elsewhere that promises alterity without violence, or that assumes violence without alterity. Against all three of these, I pose this triptych as an attempt to bring these three settler states into closer proximity and coalitional alliances among those of us who seek to critique them and to build new CRIP futures. And the last image here is with Mexico in the cardinal north direction and followed by the United States and Canada. So an upside down map of North America. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. That was fabulous. That was so interesting. I love the way you bring in so many elements into your work and connect so many seemingly far-reaching and disparate elements. So I don't see any questions yet. So maybe I can ask the first one, and it, if I may, it concerns, well, it picks up on something that was noted on one of your slides about the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving. That distinction is something that disability theorists and activists, particularly in the UK, have, disability theorists with a Marxist analysis or a socialist analysis, economically based analysis, have paid special attention to. And so, but their distinction between the deserving and the undeserving has, I guess you could say, traditionally or historically, being confined to distinctions between almost two essentialized categories of non-disabled people and disabled people. If you could summarize how you think that your analysis expands the categories of deserving and undeserving, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's not necessarily my analysis so much as that really I take a large chunk of the theoretical work by Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell, in particular, and their terms of like framing of what counts as disabled or non-disabled. And so I think I've done the work that I did for your chapter was actually looking at how, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act actually cuts a very fine line in terms of what counts as a disabled person who's deserving of rights and protections versus those who are not. And one of those categories that kind of cleaves a difference is that people can look at the transcripts from the when the ADA was being debated in Congress, and that, for example, conservative members of Congress were debating whether the term they used was transvestites, but also drug users and a number of other people were kind of being used as tropes to show that there are very undeserving populations for protections and rights. And so I think that was the example is less so a kind of medicalized distinction or even a kind of even health-centric distinction, but more so about who's considered worthy of civil protections. And I think the reason why I kind of that I find Snyder and Mitchell's work so helpful is because it also helps me think through why, for example, those who have been incarcerated and those who face criminal charges are also deemed disposable and not deserving of healthcare resources or other kinds of general protections. And I think that kind of distinction between deserving and undeserving is not simply a medicalized category, but one that we see medical institutions utilizing in a different way in order to shore up resources or not, or to preserve a kind of institutional integrity or what have you. And I think that's one of the things that also flagged a very interesting piece for me about how, we see the exportation of correctional healthcare to transnational contexts. And so I find that very interesting, is that then recycles notions of deserving and undeserving across now other transnational sites. And I think that's a concern.
Okay, that's a great response. Thank you. Jonathan, did you have a question that you want to ask Andrea?
I do. Sorry, apologies for not putting it in the Q&A, but it appears that panelists can't use that. So I tried putting it in the chat, but I'll ask it very quickly. It's only a very minor point about in the US healthcare for prisoners, because one of the things that has sometimes been said in criticism of the US healthcare system is that healthcare is actually better for people when they're in prison than very often for the same people when they're outside. So I don't know if that is true or whether it has any bearing on your analysis, but I'll be interested in your comments.
Yeah, I mean, this is just to also tell you where my mind is going with this. Yes, this is a question I've received many times. It's an interesting question. It's one that has people have done empirical and comparative work across different states and their provisions of healthcare. But I think that the interesting question for me was also, well, what happens when you have provincially provided healthcare? And then, and so almost the inverse of that question is like, when you have provincially provided care, what happens to those who become incarcerated in the Canadian context? But yeah, so what's interesting about, I think that claim that people who are that, and I think there's different versions of the claim. Some are that there's like the kind of very kind of curt response of some people say, well, prison gives people 3 meals and healthcare, so that's actually a good thing. But I think what we see is that people who have often not received healthcare, including mental health care, while not incarcerated, sometimes receive their first diagnoses while incarcerated of mental health conditions, but also untreated medical conditions and so on. And so I think we see the kind of like emergence of data from incarcerated populations, which also tell us that those who are already within this kind of carceral landscape, who are themselves facing policing, unemployment, sometimes, if we're thinking in terms of gender variance, sometimes policing combined with sex work and other kinds of labor vulnerability, that those folks may not be receiving health care and often are not receiving health care while living in a general but while being unincarcerated. And so I think what we see is this kind of like emergence of the data regarding people's health conditions while incarcerated. But I think what that tells us is not that there's something good about prison healthcare, because of course we have many. So for example, Eighth Amendment jurisprudence tells us that there's been egregious forms of neglect and harm within prison healthcare in particular. There's also really constrained law in the United States that says that you can't actually even file a grievance under the Eighth Amendment unless it's like willful neglect and criminal level neglect. And so it also gets really, really narrow. But in any case, what that tells us is not that the prisons themselves are providing good healthcare, but that in fact the lack of healthcare across the U.S. landscape is so dire that many people are remaining untreated and undiagnosed and without resources and support. And so I think that there's like I could go into it a bit more, but like the kind of health risks, for example, they look at populations based on 18 to 25-year-old African-American men, and the kinds of health risks that population experiences outside of prisons is so incredibly dire, which includes police-related violence, that those kinds of things are actually like leading to high forms of wounding and harm and death of that particular demographic. And so when incarcerated, that the risk factors change. And so people say, well, look, you don't have the same risk for gun violence as you would for someone who's living in a highly, a policed urban area, for example. So, there's a lot more to say there, but I don't think it tells us that prison healthcare is good. I think it tells us that U.S. healthcare is devastatingly awful and part of the necropolitical apparatus we're describing.
Okay, I think that there are no questions, but I think that we should probably wrap it up so that we have a few minutes to break before we start again at the top of the hour. 1400 hours in the UK. If you're on Eastern time, it will be 9 o'clock. And if you're on Pacific time, it will be 6. Please join me in thanking Andrea J. Pitts for a tremendous discussion and a wonderful presentation, wonderful slides, as expected. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll be back later. Thanks. Take care.